Thank you so much for joining our weekly Hapara webinar series. I'm really excited today. I've got Dr. Eric Youngman. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Eric's a Director of Curriculum Instruction and Assessment for Libertyville District 70 in Libertyville, Illinois. And he's previously been a principal as well as an assistant principal and I think first grade teacher in Gurnee, Illinois.
Correct.
So you've done almost everything that you can do in the education ranks. So thank you for taking time to join us today.
My pleasure.
One of the big reasons we reached out to Eric to join us today is you actually wrote a book, which is the 12 characteristics of deliberate homework. So kind of a little bit of background, I had the opportunity to read your book, and for those of the people who haven't yet, it's on Amazon, or if you think Bezos has too much of our money already, you can Google it and buy it straight from the publisher, which is what I did. But Eric, why write a book? What kind of sparked your interest on it?
Well, it's interesting. I've done a lot of research based on the jobs that I was asked to do. And so as my job as curriculum director, we were researching grading. And so ultimately that's what I wrote my dissertation about. 2 years ago, I was tasked with discussing and helping define homework protocols for the school district. And so ultimately I started talking about homework belief statements. I did a little research. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I reached out to Kathy Vatterott to gather her perspective, and I talked with her. And ultimately, after helping Libertyville District 70, I then started to share some of my slides and information on Twitter. And ultimately, I started presenting a little bit more, like at ASCD, and I started to get enough information where then I started to reach out to other authors to get some feedback about publishing companies that I could work with. And I created a proposal, and it was accepted by Routledge. And then I had about 2 months to do that writing. But ultimately, I saw an issue with homework where I wanted to help students and parents and teachers with it. And I don't think they really have a lot of time to read lengthy books. So I really just created a lot of questions, a lot of images that can really guide professional development. But hopefully it just sparks some reflection and discussion about how you can assign homework. Because on my interactions on Twitter, I found out that parents and educators are very passionate about grading and homework. And some people will have some really sharp criticism if you're assigning homework or if you're not. And so rather than analyzing all the research and doing my own studies, I just switched it to say, if you are going to assign homework, this is how you should assign it.
I was going to say that for me was one of the more interesting parts, because I think you say it at the beginning and then you definitely say it at the end that you're not talking about belief on whether or not homework should be assigned in the first place. It's just if you're going to do it, here's the best practice for how you can do it.
Correct.
Excellent. Well, so for our followers, before I forget to ask, and for the people who are listening, if they want to follow you on Twitter, what's your Twitter handle?
At Eric_Youngman, and it's Eric with a K, E-R-I-K. And again, it's interesting on Twitter because like right now with the pandemic, I'm able to follow a variety of educators to see what's happening in their classroom, in their school, in their school district. I'm sharing information with them, but I'm definitely learning from them every day. So it's an awesome way to learn. You can participate in chats. It's a challenge for me to participate in chats because I have my 3 daughters. So usually I'm just reviewing or creating content, but you can learn a lot from a variety of educators. So if you're not active on Twitter, I highly encourage you begin to do so.
Absolutely. Well, and it was interesting too in reading your book. It's published in 2020, but I'm sure it was, written end of 2019, early 2020, and the world changed dramatically, in the first few months of the year. So I think that it should be like pre-COVID 2020 as a publishing date, probably now. But how has it changed? From your standpoint, what changed in terms of, you've got your 12 characteristics. Did it stay the same, do you think, in the new virtual world? Has it changed a little bit?
Good question. I mean, some people may think it's not great to release a book about homework during a pandemic, and I would probably agree, but I definitely can put that spin on it that it's ever as much relevant. because you are right now assigning independent practice opportunities for students. And so if you have homework protocols that can guide your independent practice, I think you'll be in a good situation. And so my focus on the book was about deliberate homework, being reasonable, meaningful, informative, and consistent. And really, I focused the most on being reasonable regarding completion time and complexity and frequency. And then when we're talking about meaningful, I talked about a meaningful purpose, learning targets, a learning mindset, which I flipped into a growth mindset, meaningful format, and a meaningful sequence. And so all of those topics, when you're thinking about homework, they absolutely apply right now. You may be teaching your students in person and they have independent practice in the school or at home. You may be teaching students remotely, and along with our favorite words now, synchronous and asynchronous, there are opportunities for independent practice, and I think homework protocols can guide that. So again, the focus is reasonable and meaningful independent practice. And now, as I have presented at other national conferences, I'm folding that independent practice during remote learning into the homework conversation. So I'm presenting for AMLE about middle schools in a couple of weeks, and I folded that into the presentation. So that's what the book focuses on. Incorporated into the book, though, are some things that teachers and educators really need to unlearn. So when you're making change, sometimes you need to unthink and change some of your previous practices. So you don't have to assign homework every day. You don't have to assign 40 minutes of homework because it's a fourth grade student. I know there are some guidelines regarding how much homework students should have, but really those guidelines were a maximum if it is assigned. So some other things that we can reimagine or unthink is about support for homework. Again, thinking through how can teachers support those students? If it's harder to support those students who have questions, maybe that's just another reason to assign it in class. The due date. Sometimes you always just want to say, I have a spelling test on Friday, so therefore I'm always going to have homework due on Thursday. You can provide multiple days for the students, and that kind of empowers some flexibility. And also the task. I think sometimes we're just too focused on practice. Let's practice these spelling words. Let's practice math, where it's 12 problems and then 3 really difficult story problems. We can modify how we do that. We can provide short, consolidated opportunities. We can provide opportunities for innovation or exploration, where the students can make connections. We can differentiate more. A lot of the times we're just assigning the same problems to all of our students. And then I think we also can provide opportunities for students to communicate. So how can they ask questions about their learning? How can they investigate? So again, I'm just trying to make some modifications because when you're talking about homework and independent practice, I think we need to reflect on how it was done before and how we can make those changes. And during this pandemic right now, it is not an easy time. It's a challenging time for students. It's a challenging time for families, for teachers, but it does provide us an opportunity to make some changes. And I think our independent practice or our homework is one of those things that we can start to change.
I think that's a great point. And I mean, if we think about it, you know, post-pandemic or pre-pandemic or, you know, back in kind of regular practice, one of the things that I thought was interesting is, you know, we grew up very much in kind of that drill and practice homework environment. And so do you think that because that's kind of the expectation of parents, that maybe that's why like the change in how we approach homework maybe doesn't happen as quickly as say it might otherwise because of those expectations?
I think you're correct. I think, again, I did my research on grading and homework, and those are two topics that parents are very passionate about because they at least have experienced it. But I think ultimately, if we can just make things more concise, I have 3 daughters, and they are very overactive in sports. And so when they're playing on multiple sport teams, maybe on multiple club teams as well, they don't have that much time for homework, and that shouldn't be the excuse. But at the same time, you then fast forward to what it looks like at middle school or at the high school, and they have multiple teachers who are all assigning homework. And so it's just ultimately, I think the answer is if people could just make it more concise, it can be reflective, it can empower self-assessment, but we do need to modify it because the students are overburdened right now. And if you think of right now how students are feeling, I think they are a little stressed out, and sometimes those are expectations from parents. Sometimes they're overscheduled. Right now in the pandemic, it's probably a lack of interaction with some of their peers. But homework, I think, is one of those stressors. I'm writing a chapter for a book right now about not assigning homework on extended weekends or holidays. And again, that's just a minor thing, but if we can rethink how we do homework in general, and at the same time, make some exceptions at different times. I'm talking to my fifth grader, and she said, I'm just totally looking forward to the weekend because it's an extended weekend. Our students, our children look forward to those breaks. So when we're talking about concise homework, some of it is that frequency, and times maybe we don't have to assign it as well.
I think that's a great point, and I think that as teachers come back now, post pandemic, now's the time to implement that change if they want to, because everything's changed. So now they can say, because they've done online learning, and because the classroom looks different now, it's probably the opportunity to implement a lot of these characteristics that you talk about in your book.
Yeah, even for education in general, I mean, you're thinking about teaching students some new computer programs or some new resources, and you kind of had to spread that information out so you could implement it. But now we were forced into it, and there's some great things that we can change, and the students and teachers are learning quickly from those. So it's definitely a good opportunity.
Absolutely. I forgot to mention that for people watching, if you've got questions for Eric, please feel free to type them, send them in, and I'll ask as many of them as I can, outside of the ones that I want to ask. Eric, throughout the book, you talk about how homework can often be an equity problem, and it's something that we've talked a lot about on some of these different webinars that we've done. We did a great one a couple of weeks ago on school data and how that can be used to, and how that can be used to identify equity issues. In terms of, every kid has a different home situation or has different resources at home. What has your district done to ensure that that equity piece is made aware of, and that teachers do their best that they can to overcome it?
Yeah, equity definitely is a popular topic right now. And when we think of the pandemic and homework, it definitely can relate to that. So I think, mostly it's talking about being equitable and reasonable for every student. I think we have to have empathy and think of every student and their challenges that they have. And so while we're thinking of some of our lower ability or students with less money or less assistance at home, how can we understand that, and then how can we provide that support to that student? Because a lot of the students who are struggling in your classrooms, they're barely getting through and barely learning the math. And now if you give them homework that takes the smarter student, for lack of better words, 5 minutes to complete, and it takes this student an hour, now they're just more exasperated. So I think, when we talk about equity in our district, again, it goes back to that reasonable completion time, where we're thinking about how much time each student is spending. When we talk about the complexity, how can inequities of homework for certain students kind of guide different discussions of how we can make it for everyone. That frequency, again, it doesn't have to be every day. We don't want to overwhelm the students. And I think probably the last one is just, and I kind of alluded to it before, about that access to support. I think ultimately we want to provide students an opportunity to have agency and ownership and be self-directed. So if they do have a challenge, who can they ask? If it is the teacher, how can they get a quick response to that? So I think those are the areas that we're talking about. We're lucky we have great students, great teachers, great families in our school district. But again, you want to be cognizant of those students and families who are struggling, and homework, you don't want to add that as another thing to overburden them when they're already facing some challenges.
Yeah, and I think it's the third chapter of your book or so, you talk quite a bit about the development of student agency, and at Hapara, that's a big part of the foundation of our company, is encouraging student agency, encouraging productive conversations between teachers and students. And so, do you have any strategies maybe for the educators listening about how teachers can communicate with students around issues of homework, or try to find out if a student really is struggling and make an adjustment based on the information they get?
It's not as much strategies. I think it's just words to focus on. I recently collaborated with Knowledge Hook and was helping them with growth mindset as they provide online math to students and families. And we were really talking about how can we provide feedback to students that focuses on growth mindset. And so when I talk about growth mindset, kind of like what Dr. Carol Dweck talked about, it's really focusing on effort and attitude and success and failure. So if we can talk about how students, what their effort and attitude is all the time. Again, I'll go back to my three daughters. One of them was recently very proud of a math assessment. And again, I didn't say how smart you are. You know, my research is modifying how I interact with my kids. And I just said, you know, you had a great attitude and you put in great effort. That's why you did well. So I think when you're trying to empower self-direction, I think part of it is effort. We were talking about perseverance, resilience, and motivation. I think also is your focus and attitude to empower that ownership. I think the ability to learn and adapt. We don't always want to solve all the problems for our students. So how can we put them in situations where they do have to learn and adapt and advocate for themselves? I'm a big proponent lately about reflecting and self-assessing and setting goals. So teachers do a lot of the work, but how can we shift some of this work to the students so they can be self-directed, they can have agency, they can have ownership. And while we're doing that, I think part of it is encouraging self-talk. So when we're talking about a growth mindset, you may be providing feedback as a teacher, you may be asking questions, but ultimately, hopefully, it empowers the student to be courageous and brave and kind of have that self-talk and confidence. The other part is, I think, is how you solve problems. And so when you are providing opportunities for students to solve problems, how can you empower that curiosity and creativity? And how do you view change and a challenge? I think families have challenges as they're interacting with change and challenges, but how can they model it to their children? How can teachers model it to their students? So I think in the end, if I look through the lens of modeling and empowering resilience and a growth mindset, I think that really can set the students up well as they interact with a lot of challenges and failures. I focus a lot on sports. Like I said before, I'm big into soccer, basketball, and golf, and it's very natural when someone's learning to golf or riding a bike, you're just telling them to persevere. And if we could shift that focus when someone is learning an instrument or they're learning a difficult math problem, knowing that they are going to encounter challenges, but they can be resilient and problem solve. I think just talking through that provides a safe place and kind of empowers those students. So once they leave the classroom walls, they can do that independently.
My dad, who had a 2 handicap, tried to teach me golf for about 20 years, and he told me that I was definitely resilient and I definitely tried hard, and that I just wasn't good at it after about 20 years. So, you know, it's I guess life lessons, right? So, one of the issues that I know I ran into in school, it's an age-old problem, but is it seems like, and especially this in the higher grades, you know, the high school, middle school, it seems like unknowingly every homework assignment that you have and every test that you have is suddenly on the same 1 or 2 days, and you know, and it's a struggle for all students and all kids. How at the school level can we encourage, are there strategies to get teachers to talk? Is there technology that we can use? Like how can we encourage this? Because it's one of the problems, and I know for you it's that's a problem when it comes to, you know, a reasonable completion time, is when everything kind of bumps together.
And that's a question that I ask in my book. Some of the parts of my book are more just questions rather than solutions. But I think, again, the answer would be that reasonable completion time, complexity, and frequency. Again, we don't have to assign homework every day. We need to change that mindset. The thought can be, what can you do in your classroom? What exit tickets can you provide? An exit ticket can be one question. That can be digital, it can be verbal, it can be on paper. So I think we really need to analyze what can we do within our class to decrease that amount of homework. And then I do provide one example in the book where it's an oversimplified one, but if I'm thinking about a high school or a middle school, we could just say, for example, that each primary subject, so if we think of math, language arts, science, and social studies, they get 1 day for an assessment. So assessments for social studies can only happen on Friday, and that means they can only assign homework on Thursday. By doing that, then you would only have homework and assessments in one class at a time. So that's oversimplified. At middle school, you have more than 4 classes, but you might be able to prioritize that. And that could be an extreme example. Maybe you try that for 2 weeks or a month, and then that facilitates a conversation about how future changes can be. But I think it really comes down to communication with the other teachers. It talks about a consistent expectation at the district level. Our result was creating homework belief statements where they were general, but they did guide some of the discussions and expectations that teachers, students, and parents could have. But I think really it comes down to communication and being reasonable, because even if you're not an athlete, if you play a musical instrument, if you're in high school, if you're forced to work, if you have to watch your other kids, you're sitting in school for at least 6 hours. Right now, you're sitting behind a computer for at least 6 hours. Do you really need to do 2 more hours of homework? If you're in high school and middle school and you have 8 classes and each teacher says, oh, I'll just give them 20 minutes each, well, that compounds and adds up quickly. So your question is great. I think ultimately if people just provide concise, less frequent homework and communicate more, I think that'll be better for the students. I think a lot of it also, it drills down to those priority standards and how can you think of good questions to ask. If you're doing a math assignment, maybe you talk about the challenging problem in class and you let them choose a couple easier problems. So there's a variety of ways to do it, but I think ultimately it's less homework. And also, I do talk about how some communities basically don't want to assign any homework. Other communities think you should have daily mandated and a lot of homework. So again, I think it's that balance. You do have to understand your community and your stakeholders, and maybe you're in a place where you really need minimal homework. So that's something to consider. The other thing I like to think about is rigor does not equal homework. So just because you're in advanced or gifted or AP classes, I know you have to cover a lot of content, but what are some other ways you can empower learning without assigning homework?
I think that that's a great point, and it's interesting in going through your book. For the people watching, most of them use Hapara. For those who are watching who maybe don't use Hapara, one of the tools that we have is Workspace, which is our differentiated content platform. And it's interesting going through your book because Workspace was built deliberately with 4 columns. The first lays out expectations, which we encourage them to tie it to the curriculum. Then it's the resources that the students have, that's evidence and assignments. And then finally, it's kind of that assessment column, which could be self-assessment, formative assessment, which very much follows a lot of the patterns kind of within your book. You also talk about sequence and differentiation, which is important, and the platform allows teachers to quickly and easily group students and give them different work without them knowing it. For us, the biggest barrier for teachers getting into that is time, right? It's the time for the teacher to put together the workspace or to go into the community of the 20,000 workspaces that teachers have shared out there and find the right one. What advice do you have? I mean, once it's set up or once the homework assignment, you figured it out, it's deliberate, you can reuse it year to year, you can do those pieces. But how does your district deal with teachers finding the time for those lesson plans, especially now that they really have to be digital content creators?
It's such a challenge because even as we're talking about professional development, we do have some remote learning planning days, which are basically like an institute day, but we also need to provide students and teachers time to plan as well. So time really is a challenge. But if we're just talking about the planning, we did make some time last year and the beginning of this year as we start to target priority standards. We don't necessarily use essential questions, but if you're thinking of the critical questions that align with those priority standards, I think it can guide the discussion, it can guide the planning. I've seen other districts where the principals had to look at the teacher's lesson plans weekly. We don't do that. But again, I think if you're targeting some priority standards, and with this pandemic, this is another great opportunity for that. This is a time to really say, what do I need to focus on? What are some areas that are less important and I need to spend less time on? So that priority standards can really guide a lot of that planning and where you're spending the time. I think the other is having those consistent primary resources as well as ideas for supplemental materials. So you don't need everyone on page 6, chapter 6 on the same day. If you talk about what the primary resource they should use, but then you start to give ideas for other supplemental resources they can use, and you empower teachers to share what they're using, I think there's other ways to target the priority standards and what students are learning about. And I think ultimately that can help with engagement. So as much as possible, I think time is the biggest challenge, but if teachers can learn from a primary resource and then collaborate with their colleagues to see what they're doing, learn from their coaches. We have technology literacy coaches who help with technology components, and we also have math and literacy coaches helping with math and language arts. So as much as we can collaborate and again share good practices or effective practices of what's happening in other districts, I think that can guide a lot of it.
Absolutely. For you, I know Twitter's kind of a big way of, especially in a pandemic, we can't go to an ISTE, we can't go to an ASCD conference right now. Twitter's a great resource. Anything else that you do to kind of stay up to date on the different strategies that other districts are using?
I listen to podcasts. I do communicate with other curriculum directors in Illinois. We have meetings where we can share information, and that's been valuable. But a lot of it really has been Twitter, where I'll be looking and following certain educators, and it might be I'm looking for a certain topic. It was about remote learning in April, and I just started reading as much as I could about it. And then as I started to read those resources, I would consolidate it and make slides that I could use for presentations or share. And so I think initially I was just reading from Twitter, and you can learn a ton. But ultimately, if you start creating, then you start to facilitate that dialogue with other educators and you get more ideas. They'll ask questions, and ultimately it improves what you're doing. So Twitter really is the best resource for me. As I communicate with other educators and programs, they do talk to me a lot about podcasts, so I do try to listen to those as well. But it's hard because I'll get bombarded with emails. But a lot of that I don't focus as much on. It's really what can I find on Twitter, and then I navigate some related topics and just really learn from other educators.
Now, it's interesting. You mentioned that you had children, so you've got a unique perspective on this because you're an educator. You've got children, so you've had to do your job with kids at home learning remotely. What have some of their struggles been, and what have you learned by watching them?
I think it's great being a parent because it gives you a valuable perspective. I coach them, but I also watch them in their learning. Their mom does a great job as well as supporting their learning. But I'm lucky my kids are older. I think it would be a bigger challenge for the families that they don't have a workspace for their children. They don't have the technology or the resources, or if they're really younger students. I mean, think about the kindergartners and first graders. It's hard with that remote learning. But if I just think of my 3 daughters, they're in 5th, 7th, and 9th grade. And with that, I think some of the challenges that I noticed were some online outages. So it might have been the primary system of their school district that they were using, or even just the Wi-Fi, because the cable company decided to do an upgrade. It's something small like that, but the student is trapped at home and they can't seek support. And so my 5th grader would get really upset because she knows what to do, but she can't fix the problem, and she's upset that she's missing something, and upset her teacher knows that she's not there. So, it's a little example like that that can show us that we need to make sure that students do have all their resources and they know how to seek support, and that teachers are understanding that things are going to happen. Another one is, I think, shifting to all online work. That was a challenge in April and May. If you think about a 5th grader typing in answers for math online, but at the same time, like I said, there's some benefits. And now I think it's great because they're doing a lot more of their work online, and you can leverage some of that technology, like immediate feedback that may say exactly what's wrong with the problem, or it will give you another chance. And so technology could be a challenge for the younger students, but later I think it can be leveraged in the right ways. I think another one is lack of student participation. I think my 3 daughters are rule followers, but when they see their classmates not participating, then they don't really want to participate either. I think their cameras are supposed to be on, but some of their classmates are not. And so again, it's just they feel awkward, like they don't want to stand out in their class. I think probably the last one would again just be seeking assistance. And so maybe an assignment is pushed out to my high schooler or my fifth grader, and they may have a question or they didn't receive it. Is that teacher going to be available to help them access that resource and answer any questions, or again, be understanding if it wasn't submitted? So again, I think my three daughters have done an excellent job, but it helps me reflect and think about, what about those students who have attention issues? What about those students, again, who don't have a quiet place, who the background in their synchronous learning, has different things going on in the background that maybe shouldn't be happening. And so again, it helps you think about the challenges families are facing. So again, my daughters are doing well, but there's definitely some challenges. And again, I think educators are doing their best job, but that's why I previously mentioned, again, I think students and families are doing their best because my wife and I are working as well. And so it is hard for that work balance with everything going on.
Absolutely. It's interesting too, the, urban versus rural issues that people run into as well. We've done some student panels on here, and students who say that they can't even get to their schoolwork until about 10, 11 o'clock at night because they're the primary babysitter for their brothers and sisters until that time. So I think that it's allowed teachers and educators and the rest of the community to be far more compassionate, I think, about all of the challenges that students face at home that you don't necessarily think about when they're just coming into your classroom and leaving after 60 minutes every day. Question for you. One, actually, our CEO just sent a question in. He's watching. Thanks, Wayne. Wayne asked, he likes to ask questions about just kind of how education is shaped, former superintendent. He said, is curriculum too large or the school day too short, so homework has to be sent home? I was just curious, do you have a perspective on it either way?
Yeah, I think that's where you shift to that priority standards, because there's been some research out there, and if you were to spend an adequate amount of time on each standard, you would need way many years in education. So I think ultimately you need to shift to those priority standards. You need to succinctly ask the right questions, but we need to help teachers do that because sometimes they just want to cover content because they're expected to, and because the state assessments are going to try to hold them accountable for that. So it is a delicate balance where you can't skip too much. And I think that's a challenge just with the American education system. They don't go into enough depth because there's so many standards to cover. So I think the number of standards really is debilitating, and it is a challenge. But at the same time, that's what we currently have. So how can we kind of prioritize our focus and really empower that deeper thinking? Because we don't just want that surface level learning that the students will forget. How can we do some activities that they'll remember in the future, that they'll learn from? And so it's definitely a delicate balance.
Well put. Google Classroom's kind of become they've boomed, right? They're one of the standards now in education. I think they're 100 million users, doubled since the pandemic. I think you guys at Libertyville, you guys use a little bit of Google Classroom, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did at Hapara recently, it was in beta last year, finally released this year, we built a student dashboard, which in one page puts all of the students' to-dos, all of their homework, all of their overdue work, all of their communications in kind of a single panel. Because in some of our student discussions, the feedback with Google Classroom was that it was hard to find stuff because it was a stream and it was all sorts of different pieces. You talk in your book, one of the 12 steps to deliberate homework is communication. So what good solutions kind of have you seen out there for educators, when it comes to who might be struggling with communication?
I would probably break it down into three areas. I think ultimately students and parents, they need communication. And so the teachers need to communicate with the student. Hopefully they can independently resolve everything. But if the parent has questions, we need to provide resources for them. I think on its most basic level, it's directions. And with those directions, how do we help students stay organized? So is it a calendar? Is it a notebook? Is it an old paper planner? We need to help the students understand what the directions are and what the due dates are. I think also now that everything is online, or a lot of it is, how can the students access the assignment? So is it bringing home the right books? Is it making sure they have the correct link? But at the same time, they need to be able to access it. Otherwise, obviously, they can't do it. Also, what are resources and training for the teachers, for the students and the parents? Because if they're supposed to independently finish this activity, teachers need to know how to assign that, and then the teachers and parents need to know how to access that. And then support is related to that. If someone has a question, how can they get support? If teachers can proactively explain, this is how you problem solve. First, you read the directions. First, you contact a friend. Then you email me. That might be beneficial, so they know all of that in advance. I think other things that we can communicate are differentiated options and choices. Again, we don't need to give one assignment to everyone. So I consider it communication because it can be an example where you are understanding what the student ability is before the assignment, and you may say, if you are proficient already, you can do these 3 problems. If you need extra practice, do these 4 problems, or purely say, these are 6 options. You can choose from there. So it's not necessarily communication, but I think it's part of that process where we just need to empower the students a little more with it. And then finally, I think it's just that feedback from the teacher. So how are you discussing with the student after guided practice? What feedback are you providing as a teacher to empower that ownership and improvement? And then ultimately, how are you gathering information from that homework assignment? So if you assign that homework assignment, you should provide feedback to the student, and then you should learn something from that student, and that should inform your instruction. So a couple of those are kind of tangents related to communication, but to me, they're all related because we need to make sure that in leadership, in teaching, in working, that we're properly sending the correct message, and then that we're gathering information throughout that entire process.
Excellent. We've done a lot of these, as I talked about earlier, student-led sessions. And interestingly, the #1 feedback that we got from the students when COVID hit was that the piece that they missed the most, it wasn't talking to their friends, it was the relationships with their teachers. It was not having someone there to check on them, and be able to look at them and say, I know you're having a bad day, what's going on? So I ask everyone that we're doing these series with, within your district, what are some of the strategies that your teachers are using, or that leadership's using to try and engage with students to make sure that their social emotional well-being is supported?
I think, again, you have to look at it differently from how it was in April and May, and then compared to how we began the school year. But, we value academics, but we definitely made care and connectedness a part of it. So if you provide those synchronous meetings at the beginning of the day, that's really a check-in. It could be social emotional learning activities as well, but it really is checking in on the students and talking about how the students are in building that community. I think if you end the school year, you already have that community established. If you're beginning the school year, like now we had to in August and September, you really need to establish that culture of learning. So I think that's one way. I think the other part is just providing opportunities for parents to ask questions if it's at the kindergarten level. But as you're moving up higher in the upper grades, it's providing opportunities for students to contact their teacher. So it might be something as office hours, or just an open Google Meet that parents or students could attend just to ask some questions. It might be during a synchronous activity where you did the teaching, the students talked about it, and then after the guided practice for independent practice, students had a choice where they might be able to turn their camera off, but the teacher was still available. It might be using breakout rooms. Again, just kind of empowering those opportunities where it is interaction with the teacher or in small group, because you've been on meetings, I'm sure too, where you're meeting with a group of 25 or more people, and it's challenging to have those conversations. But if you make that into smaller groups, that provides yet another opportunity where it's a little bit safer. for students to talk and for everyone to listen to that student as well.
Absolutely. I found that interesting too. We had a teacher on who said that a couple of her students who didn't participate a lot in class, their participation actually increased quite a bit since going remote, because they felt more comfortable being able to sit back and answer, and they were comfortable in their space and it wasn't in the classroom. So it's interesting too how it goes all sorts of different directions and that you don't necessarily expect.
Absolutely. There's some challenges we didn't expect, and then there's some benefits and certain students who are struggling, but there's other students, I would agree, who are doing quite well with the setup.
Awesome. Well, Eric, thank you so much for your time. Again, for those people watching, 12 Characteristics of Deliberate Homework. I've got a copy. The one thing I really like about it, Eric, too, that I'll compliment you on is it's more of a workbook than anything. You give a lot of opportunities for self-discovery and writing down kind of what current practice is and how you hope to change it. So for teachers, I see it as a really good opportunity to just kind of reflect on current practice and hopefully change if it's needed to be changed, so that we do have more deliberate homework for students.
Thank you. I appreciate that, because with the book, when I'm at conferences, even today's webinar, jot down 1 or 2 notes. What are 1 or 2 topics that we talked about today that you can navigate or explore yourself? And then the second part is talk about it with a colleague, because if you just leave today and don't write anything down, you're probably not going to change any of your practices. But if you think about something and then talk about it with one of your colleagues, I think it's a pretty powerful way just to, again, empower that reflection and ultimately provoke some changes.
Absolutely. I love that challenge for everybody listening and everyone who's going to download it in the future. Talk about it with a colleague, and hopefully we can put some of the change into action.
Absolutely. We're all doing a collaborative job trying to do what's best for students. So again, educators are doing a great job, and I'm glad everyone is listening to this, and thanks for all you're doing, and good luck.
Perfect. Thanks, Eric. Good luck. You guys start going back face-to-face in a few weeks, you were saying. So good luck with all of that planning, and make sure to stay safe.
All right. Thank you. You too.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.